Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the first of many of our online events for 2022. Last year saw us host close to 30 riveting online events, all related to the two core pillars of our educational mission: learning more about the Holocaust in Israel to ensure a better understanding of the past in order to create a better future for all going forward. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Whilst the Holocaust is widely recognized as the world's greatest crime against humanity and the, excuse the term, quintessential genocide, there are so many aspects of the horrifying acts of the beastly actions of human on human that took place during the Holocaust that are not widely known nor understood. And it is incumbent on us to continuously enhance our knowledge and to raise our voices and act in the name of social justice, human rights, and against discrimination, bigotry, hate, persecution, or worse. We have the privilege this evening to hear from an expert in his field, Associate Professor Michael Robertson. Michael is an Associate Professor of Mental Health Ethics in the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, a visiting professorial fellow at the Sydney Jewish Museum, and a member of the Australian Institute of Holocaust and Genocide Scholars. He has published in the area of medical ethics, psychotherapy, and the medical profession under National Socialism. His clinical work focuses on complex and historical trauma. In 2019, he published, together with Edwina Light and Astrid Lay, The First Into the Dark, the Nazi Persecution of the Disabled. As Michael will discuss, Holocaust scholar Henry Friedlander described the Nazi euthanasia program as providing the hardware and software for the final solution. While in essence this is true, the reality is more complex. The Nazi persecution of the sick, elderly, and disabled was an aggregate of crimes now subsumed under the term Krankenmorde, the murder of the sick. Many of the perpetrators of these crimes would later apply their skills in mass murder to the industrialized slaughter of the Shoah. Of the 300,000 people murdered in the Krankenmorde, 70,000 perished in Aktion T4, the most recognized of these crimes. What we now should acknowledge is that Jewish patients in German psychiatric hospitals, described by Israeli academic psychiatrist Rael Strous as the doubly cursed, were murdered in static gas chambers as early as January 1940 by the same perpetrators who would establish the Reinhard death camps. Thus, the first Jewish victims of the Nazi regime were murdered by poison gas years before the Wannsee conference. In this presentation, Michael will outline the history of the Krankenmorde and situate it within the current historiography of the Holocaust. Following, Michael will discuss the contemporary significance of these crimes, focusing on the rights of people with disability. Michael will begin his presentation shortly, and this will be followed by a Q&A session where we would love you to engage with the speaker. Before I hand over to Michael, allow me to please touch briefly on a number of housekeeping matters. During the presentations, everyone bar Michael will be on mute. It would be great, though, if you could keep your videos, cameras on during the presentation, though, as it is always nicer for the presenter to see the audience when presenting. We call on you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screens to make any comments or pose any questions. And if questions are submitted, these will be used to kick us off during the Q&A that will follow thereafter. And finally, just a reminder that the session will be recorded and will be available on our socials and our website for you to share with others if you so wish. And now, with further ado, it's over to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric, and warm greetings from Ku-ring-gai country. I would echo your remarks to our First Nations people. Thank you very much to March of the Living for the opportunity to present on this topic. I'd like this to be a companion presentation to Darren O'Brien's excellent presentation last year, which unpacked a lot more of the history that I'll be able to unpack this evening. Okay. So we begin by talking about the Herzl family. So in 1889, Theodor Herzl married Julie Nassauer, the daughter of a successful Jewish Viennese businessman, Jakob Nassauer. The marriage was pretty unhappy, partly due to Julie's inability to adapt to a homemaker role, and also due to Theodor's profound disapproval of Julie's behavior and housekeeping in particular. There were prolonged periods away as Herzl was championing the Zionist cause. And despite this very torrid and difficult marriage, Julie bore two children in Vienna, Pauline, born in 1890, and Hans, born in 1891. 2 years later, Margareta Gertrude Herzl was born in Paris. Now, because of their mother's apparent germophobia, the Herzl children were not allowed to play with other kids. And in the words of Herzl's biographer, Amos Elon, they were pampered, overindulged, raised as junior royalty in a golden cage with only the most minimal and carefully supervised exposure to the outside world. Now, as we know, Theodor succumbed to heart disease in mid-1904, and Julie died 3 years later. Theodor was buried in Vienna with over 6,000 mourners, and Hans, then 13, said Kaddish. Julie Herzl's remains, however, had quite a different farewell. Hans seems to have left Julie's ashes on a train, in a suburban train. Now, the adolescent Herzl children, after their parents died, were left virtually destitute and fell into the charity of various Zionist organizations in Europe. Pauline Herzl slumped into a severe heroin addiction and died in 1930 from a heroin overdose. Hans had been sent to a Jewish boarding school in England, but had struggled with his own identity and psychological distress, particularly his identification with Judaism. For some reason, his father had omitted to have Hans circumcised, and he was only circumcised in his adolescence. In his adult years, Hans had actually consulted Jung and Freud about his identity crisis and his distress, and he started flirting with Christian denominations. Hans committed suicide on the day of his sister's funeral. His suicide note includes the statement, "A Jew remains a Jew, no matter how eagerly he may submit himself to the disciplines of his new religion. A Jew remains a Jew." Einstein wrote of Hans Herzl 2 years later that he, quote, his wasted life constitutes a warning to all Jews against defections from their people. Margareta fared little better. Now, through the generosity of Zionist benefactors, Margareta attended a gymnasium in Vienna, but her education was disrupted profoundly when she suffered an episode of manic psychosis at age 17. She dropped out of school and attempted to audit various university courses, but couldn't complete them. She was first hospitalized in her mid-20s with another psychotic episode in what was proving to be a severe and persistent mental illness. Despite this, after a volatile courtship, she married a wealthy Viennese industrialist, Richard Neumann, in 1917. Neumann was divorced and nearly 30 years his senior. A year later, she gave birth to their son, Stephen. Margareta's mental state did not improve, and she spent time in various psychiatric institutions, often confined against her will in secure psychiatric wards. When she was unwell, she was grandiose and wrote letters to world figures, including writing letters directly to Hitler and Churchill about the conduct of the war. Richard's business suffered during the Great Depression, and increasingly Zionist benefactors had to fund Margareta's hospitalizations. In the mid to late 1930s, she was admitted to the sanatorium Inzeldorf. However, after October 1940, the National Socialist Gauleiter in Vienna ordered that all Jewish patients were to be admitted to specific Jewish hospitals, and Margareta was admitted to the Sanatorium Pückersdorf on the outskirts of Vienna in late October 1940. In mid-March 1941, she was transferred to the Am Steinhof in Vienna. under what was called the Pflegglaser 3, or a care arrangement, meaning that the local municipality would have to fund her care. Now, this photograph here, it's a little bit grainy, but it features the buildings of the Steinhof, which you can still visit, and it's famed for its Kirche, its church, which was designed by architect Otto Wagner, who was, I suppose, by appointment to the Emperor Franz Joseph. And the buildings of the Steinhof are considered to be excellent examples of early 20th century Art Nouveau in Vienna. Now, like all patients living with mental illness, Margareta was registered with the T4 committee. And as Darren's talk last year unpacked that history, everybody in care institutions, hospitals, no matter who operated them, had to be registered to a central committee in Berlin. So this is Margareta's T4 registration card. And you'll note that the family history is outlined. The daughter of the known father of Zionism, Dr. Theodor Herzl. There's mentioning that her sister, Geisteskrank, meaning illness, brother committed suicide. Mutter hysterisch, which means mother was hysteric. I think being married to Theodor would be no easy task for anyone. Her father was deemed to be neurasthenic. She's diagnosed with schizophrenia, characterized by gross grandiosity and auditory hallucinations. Now, what's missing in this form is down here is where the T4 assessors would designate whether a patient would be condemned to death or to survive. However, in the Steinhof, Margareta remained until May 1942. If you read her clinical file, in January of 42, she slipped on a marble floor where she was doing some cleaning duties, and she fractured her right shoulder and right neck of femur. Her file indicates that she was sent for surgical treatment and then convalesced for a period of a few months in an aged care facility in the town of Leinz, and was returned to the Steinhof in 42. Just sort of kind of counter to what one might expect of the fate of people in that sort of period in those institutions. Now, in September 1942, Margareta and her husband were deported from Vienna to Theresienstadt on the transport number 4/10, numbers 967. Now, this is the I suppose when you look at the database, the Holocaust database in Czechoslovakia, or in the Czech Republic now, it notes that her last residence prior to that was Puckersdorf, and that she was transported on this particular transport, and that she was murdered in March 1943. Now, Margareta's remains were never located, and she is the only Herzl family member not buried on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. This is the death certificate of Reinhard, who died in January of 43 of cardiac failure. Now, Jakob von Hoddes was the nom de plume of a Berlin-born Jewish expressionist poet, Hans Davidson. He was one of 4 children. He was the oldest, and he was one of twins. His father was also a public health physician. Jakob attended the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium, but faltered in his studies, and he dropped out in 1905 and completed his studies the following year by correspondence. He then tried to enter and study architecture in Charlottenburg and abandoned this in the year following. And then in 1907, attempted to study philology at the University of Jena, which was Hegel's alma mater. He was unable to sustain these studies, and he returned to Berlin to pursue a career as a poet and a writer. Now, in 1909, he co-founded Der Neue Club, which was a literary institution which held evenings of poetry and recital under the title Neo-Pathetischer Kabarett. Van Hoddes, his most famous poem was entitled Weltende, or The End of the World, and was published in 1910 in the Berlin magazine Der Demokrat. Now, it actually reads better in German, so if you'll indulge me. Dem Bürger fliegt vom spitzen Kopf der Hut. In allein Lüften hallt es wie Geschrei. Dachdecker stürzen ab und gehen entzwei. Und an den Küsten liest man, stiegt der Flut. Der Sturm ist da, die wilden Meere hüpfen. entlang, dicke Dämme zu zerdrücken. Die meisten Menschen haben eine Schnupfen, die Eisenbahnen fallen von der Brücken. Quite prophetic. Most people have a cold, their noses drip. I wonder if he had some Nostradamus-like foresight to our current situation. Now, Van Hoddes's mental health continued to decline. In January 1912, two of his close friends drowned ice skating and he fled to Munich. And like Hans, Herzl started dabbling with Christianity. He suffered then a series of breakdowns. He was placed in private psychiatric care during the First World War. His mental state deteriorated catastrophically after his brother Ludwig was killed in action in the First World War. In 1922, he moved to Tübingen and was placed in the state clinic at Christophsbad, just as on the outskirts of Stuttgart. Now, Christophsbad was a site of some of the research work we did for the book and some of our other academic outputs. The clinic was actually founded in 1839 on the site of a famed health spa, which from the 16th century saw royalty come and sort of take over the waters. So this building is an example of the architecture around the time of the establishment of the institution. This sort of neoclassical fountain is a font of exquisite mineral water, which was actually used to fund a lot of the hospital's operations. And having drank a glass of that on one of our fieldwork visits, I can vouch for the quality of the product. Now, Jacob's family fled to Tel Aviv in early 1933, but the British authorities in the then Palestinian Mandate refused to allow Jacob to emigrate with them because of his mental illness. This was a very common theme in mid-century immigration laws. Excuse me. He was transferred from Christophsbad to an institution in Koblenz soon after his family fled Germany. Now, unlike Margarete Neumann, Jacob survived the Aktion T4 phase of the Krankenmorde, but in April 1942 was deported to Sobibor, where he was murdered soon after arrival. Now, Jacob is probably the most famous and celebrated ex-patient of Christophsbad, and his memory is commemorated with many other T4 victims. This is a statue dedicated to his memory, including some of his poetry. Now, our third memorial vignette is of Sonia Wexler, near Krupnik. Sonia was born in 1886 on the Lithuanian-Latvian border. She was the daughter of an estate administrator, and she was sent as a child to Liepāja to learn tailoring. In 1907, she joined the local Bund and met her future husband, Tuvia. Sonia and Tuvia married in 1911, and between 1912 and 1922, she had their 4 children. The Wexlers moved to Hamburg, but soon after Tuvia's father died in 1926, Tuvia became deeply religious and engaged with Judaism to the point where it caused intense conflict with his family. Now, the conflict within the Wexler family, including the children, causing all sorts of tension, placed Sonia under huge emotional pressure, and she developed what sounded to be a quite severe depressive illness. And by 1930, she was placed in psychiatric treatment, and in 1934 was admitted to the Friedrichsberg State Psychiatric Hospital. Now, like the Van Hoddes family, Tuvia sought to relocate the family to Palestine to escape the emergent National Socialist regime, but like the Van Hoddeses, were unable to take Sonia with them. The Wexlers fled progressively over 1934 and 1935 without Sonia, where she remained in Friedrichsberg and was later transferred to the Langenhorst State Hospital. On the 23rd of September 1940, she was placed on a transport, one of the Gekrat grey buses, and was sent to the killing center at Brandenburg an der Havel, where she was murdered in the gas chamber, one of nearly 2,000 Jewish victims of the Aktion T4. We see here the Stolperstein that Sonia's family installed at her last address in Hamburg. The man who murdered Sonia, was Irmfried Eberl, here photographed in, I think, an Aktion Organisation Todd uniform. Eberl's story is very much the portrait of the historical nexus between Krankenmorde and the Shoah, and figures like Eberl, Stangl, Christian Wirth, Kurt Franz perpetrated horrendous crimes in both Krankenmorde and the Shoah, particularly Aktion Reinhard. And I'll explain a little later how that historiography has played out and how it sort of shapes our thinking about this period. This is a photograph of the Tötungsanstalt, the killing center in Brandenburg. It was built on the site of an old prison. This is the old prison building. The victims would arrive on the bus through this gate. The gas chamber complex was a wooden construction just behind this, this wall here. So I've just gone backwards. Now, Eberl, sorry about the graphic nature of the photograph, Eberl became the initial commandant of Treblinka. He had, after Brandenburg was decommissioned, went on to be the euthanasia physician at Bernburg. He had a period on the Eastern Front where it was thought that he was euthanizing gravely wounded German soldiers. He took a period of time away when his then wife was ill with cancer and died. He then seemed to serve as a medic in an infantry battalion. He was taken prisoner by the Americans. He obtained his personal sheen and was supposed to have been denazified, and then started practicing medicine as a general practitioner in Ulm. He was identified by a former nurse at Hadamar, I think, as being a T4 or a euthanasia physician. He was taken into police custody and hanged himself in his cell prior to facing trial. Now, as I'd mentioned, the T4 committee was based at the former Liebermann house. The Liebermanns were wealthy textile merchants. Their house was appropriated, or dare I say stolen, by the SS Economics Office in 1939 and repurposed to house the program to coordinate the mercy death of those deemed life unworthy of life, and hence the term T4 for Tiergartenstraße number 4. Now, the three figures who were prosecuted at the doctor's trial in 1946, Karl Brandt, Philippe Bouleur, and Victor Brack, were all key functionaries of the KDF, or the Führer's Chancellery. Brandt is a very interesting character, and I think should be the subject of another talk at some point. The indictment against Brandt in Nuremberg focused primarily on the medical experimentation in the camps that he had signed off. The euthanasia crimes were a smaller part of the overall indictment, and there's been a lot of criticism about the injustices at Nuremberg because many prosecutions failed or weren't even sought because the Nuremberg judges determined that it was the law of the land and that they couldn't be prosecuted as a sort of post hoc prosecution. Now that was later addressed with trials in West Germany predominantly. Brack was, I think, the quintessential Nazi functionary, and the significance of Brack in this narrative is that after T4 ceased operations in the summer of 1941, Brack was left with a number of accomplished killers with no remit. Now, the reasons that the T4 program was stopped, traditionally the narrative was it was the intercession of the Bishop of Münster, Clemens von Galen, and a series of thundering sermons he'd given, although the more sober kind of examination of this period indicates that it likely ceased because, one, they may have basically murdered the number of people that they sought to murder, or perhaps more incredibly was that there was significant discontent within the German population. The only known protest against Hitler took place in Bavaria when a group of train passengers at a train station were seeing victims being loaded onto a train carriage. And given at the time they had just launched Barbarossa, it was sort of felt that things were best left undisturbed. There's certainly correspondence between various functionaries and Himmler about discontent about the killing centers and so on. So it's a little bit less tidy than is made out. But nonetheless, the issue here was that Brack had a cohort of killers with nothing to do, basically. And then after the decision was taken in January 42 to enact the Entlosung, the final solution, Brack sought to situate himself in the middle of this and offered the services of his crew to Odio Globochnik, the chief of police in Lublin. And after this, we had the initiation of Aktion Reinhard, the establishment of the 3 extermination camps in Poland, staffed by former T4 killers, both physicians, nurses, and other functionaries. And so, as I say, many of the most despicable and notorious criminals of the Shoah began their criminal careers in the Krankenmorde. Now, it's only since German reunification, excuse me, that records have been available to allow a little bit more of a closer study on this period. And I wanted to sort of return to this proposition Cedric introduced, the idea of the doubly cursed, and to revisit some of the work my colleague and friend Rael Strous has done in this period. Now, we know that under Krankenmorde, Jewish patients, like others, were victims of, say, the Nazi sterilization program, but they were not sterilized on racial grounds. The only known instance of the application of the hereditary health laws on racial grounds was the compulsory sterilization of the mixed race children in the Rhineland, the so-called Rhineland bastards. These were children of French Dominion troops who had consorted with local women. Now, we do know, though, a decree from the Reich Ministry of the Interior in June 1938 ordered that Jewish patients were to be excluded from public assistance. And that's why we had these Verpflegklasse, these care arrangements that were ad hoc. It meant that basically those in public care had to resort to have care funded by the Reich Association of Jews in Germany or local or regional Jewish organizations, or in many cases, families and private citizens had to fund the care. Most of the psychiatric hospitals in Germany were run by Catholic Church under the Caritas umbrella, and many Jewish patients were excluded from these hospitals. Cost constraints meant that a new policy was formulated in 1940, which decided to concentrate Jewish psychiatric patients in various designated hospitals, Jewish psychiatric hospitals, in order to hasten their murder. So there is evidence of this process of aggregation and concentration of victims, their transportation to mass killing centers, that is essentially that template of the final solution that Friedlander had written about. So we have evidence of specific transport, so-called Sonderaktion, that specifically transported Jewish patients, regardless of the T4 committee's determination on their work capacity or their prognosis. So this is a list of Jewish patients for a transport jüdischer Patienten from Steinhof. This is a section of Ebel's diary in Brandenburg, and Ebel kept meticulous records of his activities, the number of people transported, the number of victims. And so we have a pretty good sense of who was murdered in Brandenburg. And what you'll note here, this diary was captured by the Soviets. They actually captured Ebel's apartment in the then East Berlin. But in Ebel's diary, you see in green pencil J for Juden, so the number of Jewish patients. So you had males and females, but specifically keeping records of Jewish patients. So these Sonderaktionen were set up specifically to transport Jewish patients to T4 killing centers. Now, these included German, Polish, and some stateless Jews. It's documented that mixed race Jews, those with 2 Jewish grandparents or 1 Jewish parent, weren't murdered in this particular component. From Ebel's diary, we know about 500 Jewish patients were murdered in Brandenburg, and it seems that Brandenburg, 10% of the victims of the Brandenburg killing center were Jewish. This was far disproportionate to, the percentage of the population, the Jewish population in Germany. 300 Jewish patients were murdered in the killing center in Hartheim, which is just outside of Linz in Austria. So this notion that the first victims of the gas chambers were those Jewish patients murdered by poison gas in a static gas chamber using the same methodology, if you will, that was deployed in Reinhard, does indicate that we may need to think about the history of this time and how these decisions were taken. Was Wannsee that watershed moment that we always consider it was? Now, the other evidence for this was on some of these T4 registration cards. This is from another patient from Steinhoff. This, you see the plus, which indicates the patient was condemned to death. This N is the signature of Nietzsche, who was the chief of the T4, took over from Werner Haider, I think in late 1940. But what you notice here in Nietzsche's red pencil, he's listed schizophrenia, so the diagnosis which is noted, but he's also circled Juden. And this here X number only appears on the T4 registration cards of Jewish patients. So from this, we have a pretty good idea of the number of Jewish T4 victims from this particular process. So the number of X indicates we have around 2,000 victims murdered in this way. Now, the other specific, I suppose, criminality of this was the continued defrauding of the families or of the funding institutions of the Jewish patients. Now, as we know, there were elaborate means to cover what had happened to Krankenmorde, to T4 victims in particular. Families were sent bogus death certificates, often sent urns containing somebody else's ashes, and then told later that their family member had died of pneumonia or tuberculosis or whatever. Jewish patients virtually inevitably were, their families or the funding agencies were told that their family member had been sent to the Holm Lunatic Asylum, the Irrenanstalt in Holm, near Lublin, where they were to have remained, and the families continued to pay for their care long after their family member had been murdered. Holm was a psychiatric hospital, but the SS had murdered everybody there in 1940. It was essentially a complete it was a total ruse. But this was a specific means of defrauding the families of Jewish victims. Now, the other component of the Krankenmorde, we know that after T4 finished and that it moved into the so-called decentralized phase of killing, where the killing was done by doctors and nurses in hospitals. There was a parallel crime being perpetrated in occupied territories. So in September of '39, long before the decision had been taken to murder patients with disabilities and the like, using the poison gas methodology, there were sporadic murders of asylum residents and patients in Western Poland, perpetrated predominantly by the SS, acting autonomously. And I think the most well-known of these groups were Aktion Langer, Albert Langer, I think at the time a Scharführer, Unterscharführer, coordinated the murder of patients in various hospitals in Western Poland, initially using methods such as just machine gunning or neck shot, Genickschuss. But after some experimentation done by a SS chemist, August Becker, in a disused fort in Poznan, or Posen as the German, there were experimentations on different killing methods. So there was thought given by Lange and other autonomous SS Einsatzgruppen to utilize potentially static gas chambers, as had been the prototype developed in Poznan. But Lange then experimented with Gaswagen, so the mobile gas chambers, which were later deployed by Lange, who became the initial commandant of Chelmno. So you have here like a parallel process of the murder of the sick and the disabled, independent of what's going on in Berlin or in the T4 committee. There's these aggregate of crimes that are occurring independently. And this, again, I think raises some questions about how we approach the history of this. So just on that, the question of historicization. Now, the recognition of so-called Nazi euthanasia victims is only a recent phenomenon. This is the Euthanasia Memorial. They haven't quite called it the Krankenmorde. That's a term that's only just appeared in the German historiography. This was constructed in 2013 and officially opened in 2014. It stands in front of the Berlin Philharmonie on the site of the Liebermann House in Tiergartenstraße. So the question is begged as to where to situate these crimes, because we note we have Jewish victims being preferentially targeted, murdered in the same manner in which subsequent victims were murdered in the Reinhard camps by the same killers using the same methodology. So what does this tell us about Holocaust and where to situate this part of the history? Now, there has been, I suppose, increasing controversy over the dilemma of, I think, what Harold Jacobson, a British Jewish writer, calls Holocaust avidity. Now, Yad Vashem, I think, prefers the term Shoah to refer to the aggregate of crimes against the Jewish people perpetrated by the Nazi state and its satellites. So Shoah sits first among equals, if you will, in the taxonomy of Nazi criminality. But there are other recognized targeted groups: Porajmos, the Sinti and Roma, Krankenmorde, the so-called gay Holocaust, the murder of over 1 million Soviet POWs, the specific targeting of Poles and Slavs. These different groups who are murdered often by the same perpetrators, Einsatzgruppen, the murdered in camps and the like. How do we piece this all together? And in particular, given the mechanics of the Krankenmorde and the Holocaust, what does this sort of inform us about how this crime unfolded? So if you were to look at broadly the topography of the history of this time, and this is taken from our book, Krankenmorde and Shoah as parallel processes. So it starts with compulsory sterilization, proceeds to the murder of asylum patients by Einsatzgruppen formations in Western Poland after the invasion in September 1939. The children's euthanasia program predates Aktion T4. But then we situate the murder of Jewish patients in T4 as Shoah, because arguably that is the motivation to murder them is racial. We see the various phases of the murder of psychiatric patients and patients with disabilities and the like in Germany and Austria, and subsequently Aktion 14 F13, which was the initial deployment of the T4 killers to murder and eliminate concentration camp prisoners who are too sick to work. This is prior to the camps developing their own capabilities with gas chambers. We then see, as we with Margareta Neumann and Jakob von Hoddes, the deportation of Jewish patients to their deaths in the same manner of non-psychiatric patients. We see Aktion Reinhard occurring contemporaneously with the decommissioning of T4. San Saba was a small camp in Italy. It was set up by Wirth. It was Wirth thought to, I think it's called the Riseria, it's a rice storage facility. That was a short-lived phase. And Aktion Brandt's a very controversial component of this. This was the murder of asylum patients to free up beds in institutions that were spared from the Allied bombing. So what you see is these aggregate of crimes perpetrated at times by the same perpetrators, often with the same victims using same methodologies, but are situated in different components of the history of the period. So this is why I think the questions are being raised about the manner in which these crimes were perpetrated, but also whether or not race and disability were similar, two sides of the same coin as far as this extremist moment in history is concerned. So this, if we go back, though, obviously familiar with the approaches to the Nazi regime versus the functionalist versus the intentionalist model. Put simply, the intentionalist model has it that everything that unfolded could be found in Mein Kampf, that this entire process was preordained and structured in Hitler's mind from his cell in the 1920s, whereas I think the current thinking favors the functionalist model, which depicts Hitler as a weak dictator, very much under the influence of these monsters around him. Hitler's only real idea is his virulent anti-Semitism and his preoccupation with Lebensraum for the German people. So the idea put by Martin Brojat was that the craziest or most radical idea would catch this weak, disorganized dictator's attention, and that's where the power lay within the Nazi regime. This is what Brojat calls cumulative radicalization. So you can see a Victor Brack seeking to capitalize on a power vacuum created when Hess flies off to Scotland and Hitler flies into a panic and sacks the entire KDF, thinking they're all treacherous. This is the sort of chaos within the Nazi regime. So then how do we understand the unfolding of Krankenmorde, given there's multiple aggregates of crimes being perpetrated by different people autonomously? This is not all some centrally coordinated process. So this idea of the Krankenmorde being the dress rehearsal for the Shoah, for the Endlösung, isn't as compelling in the light of the history that we now have. So again, this question of victims as prologue or the meta, the term Holocaust, has it become diluted in its sort of usage of all victims of the Nazi regime? Then, of course, the other approaches to Holocaust in terms of it as a distinct moment in the history of the Jewish people, as against a moment in the history of modernity. We have arguments now about the Western chauvinism of the iconic nature of Auschwitz as against the Holocaust by bullets. And so on. So a lot of these questions are being asked and re-examined, not just in light of what we now know from having accessed material from the former Eastern Bloc, but also just coming to a newer understanding of how this history unfolded. So to close this out, I wanted to just address very briefly the so what of this. Now, the central thesis of our book, The First Into the Dark, is that as the Shoah injuncts us to reject anti-Semitism and racism, so does Krankenmorde injunct us to identify and repudiate ableism. Now, ableism is a concept that's only recently emerged. I think it's something that's really only come into our sensibilities in the last 20 or 30 years. So ableism, also known as disableism, or what most would recognize as disability discrimination, is in essence the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities and or people who are perceived to be disabled. At its core, ableism assumes that a person with a disability has a life of lesser quality and therefore lesser entitlement than a person who is able-bodied. There are also elements of this in terms of defining a person by their disability. So somebody is an autistic, somebody is a schizophrenic, as against a person with schizophrenia. That is the default ableist paradigm I think we've all lived with. I mean, certainly through the first half of my career, that was the approach taken. The other component of this is the distinction between the social model of disability and the medical model. The medical model says, there's something wrong with you, we need to try and fix you as best we can. And if we can't, you know, bad luck to be you. As against the social model, which says we need to try harder as a society to include and accommodate to ensure that there is an equal opportunity to compete or to access. Equality of access is the sort of, I suppose, the hallmark of social justice or distributive justice that Western, you know, the liberal enlightened societies is modelled upon. Unfortunately, the social model has fallen away a little. I think the introduction of neoliberalism into disability discourse and say, for example, the way the NDIS has been constructed in terms of a consumer model and so on. So I think well-intentioned, but unfortunately a little misguided, but then again, another conversation. But to bring this back, ableism is the takeaway from this particular history. Now, if you look at the history of Atlantic or transatlantic eugenics, that is really the progenitor of ableism. And if you, again, revisit the history of this time, the preconditions to this that Darren's talk addressed last year, race and disability are two sides of the same coin and seem to be comparable motivators of the kind of crimes that we saw, not just from the Nazi regime, but also in the United States and in this country as well in that period. So how this looks now, I mean, this is a series of abstracts from the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry that I had at one point been an associate editor on, but this was looking at some of the questions that are being asked right now through the lens or the prism of disability. Questions about quality of life and judgments in bioethics, people, you know, academics referring to the tragedy of a child with cerebral palsy or Down syndrome. The understandable anxiety people with disabilities and their advocates have on end-of-life decision-making and the implications for the relative valuation of life. One of the things that has, one of the many, many lights that has been shown on our failings as a culture and as a species in COVID has been the complete and utter failure to consider the significance of people with disabilities. We are in the response to COVID and the specific vulnerabilities. I mean, the horrendous dispatches we get from the Royal Commission ongoing about not just the risks of sexual and physical abuse and neglect and the diminished lifespan and diminished quality of life and so on, but also just the specific neglect of people with disabilities during the COVID period. We also have certain assumptions and starting positions on questions of prenatal genetic testing and how it comes in conflict with reproductive rights and questions as to whether the selective termination of so-called defective or genetically defective fetuses, is this a form of eugenics? There's all sorts of questions that are being re-examined in the light of this period. Which brings me to, again, the other central methodology of our book is the construct of biopolitics or biopower, which again just refers to the control of the state over the biology of its citizens. And one could argue that Krankenmorde was not just an extreme manifestation of ableism, but also an extreme manifestation of the state's control over biology. And as these authors, Rabinow and Rose, argued, very similar to many other injunctions about the Holocaust, it's not an exceptional moment of throwback to a singular barbarism, but an enduring possibility intrinsic to the very project of civilization and the law. So with that, I shall hand back to Cedric for any questions. I shall stop the share.
Michael, I can't thank you enough. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know whether I haven't seen any questions come through, but if there is anyone in the audience who would like to ask any questions or pose any questions at this stage, Matan, if you can unmute, thank you. If there's anyone here who would like to ask a question of Michael, now is the time to do so, but possibly just if you can unmute everyone, Matan, and if anyone wants to, I see that Philip Graves has put his hand up. So Philip, you're the numero uno. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to say thank you. I am a retired developmental paediatrician, so I spent my entire career looking after people with disabilities. And during that time, I was born in 1944. I'm not Jewish, but I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust and have always been very interested in it, and now work for Courage to Care as a volunteer. And I just want to thank you and for adding more sensitization to the issues, I guess, and a lot deeper understanding of the whole culture of the time.
Well, look, thank you for your interest and your engagement with this. Thank you all who've come tonight. I think it's very interesting. I mean, paediatricians were, I don't know if they're overrepresented in terms of perpetrators, but certainly in the history of this time, the Children's Euthanasia Program, which murdered around 5,000 children, paediatricians were perhaps the most intimate of the killers. And there are some very interesting figures, shall we say, from, the Kinderärzte, as they were called, who were very instrumental in the development of children's euthanasia. But I think also I don't know how much engagement there has been with the discipline of pediatrics with this history. Certainly, I think in Germany there's been. I think it wouldn't be news to your typical Australian paediatrician, but I think this history probably hasn't been as unpacked as it should be in our history. And I think the other issue is that what does this tell us about our history, like the complicity of the medical profession in the stolen generation, in other crimes against the First Nations people, and how do we understand our history in the light of mid-century Europe, and in particular, were those crimes motivated by the same prejudices? Were they motivated by racism and ableism and the like?
100%.
And you might add
yes,
a refugee policy.
I think I played with enough matches this evening.
Yep. I'm happy to take one other comment or question if there is. If not, George Foster, by all means, please. If you can unmute, yes. Go ahead, George.
Hi, Michael.
George. Good to see
thank you for your presentation. It's nice to see you too. It was fascinating. I have a couple of thoughts. One is I have long thought about the doubly cursed, as you put them. And I wonder whether in that earlier stage, obviously by then, the Jewish people were already very much discriminated against, and therefore it would be a fairly simple step to conflate their Jewishness with their disability, which whatever that might be, and whether that was enough for them to have been treated the way they were, to have been euthanized or murdered. And then the obvious step is for those who developed that method of murdering to have then gone on to the next step of the larger murder. The other thought that I've had, particularly, well, for some time, is what you started to allude to in the latter part of your talk, which is that using the Shoah as the quintessential example of man's inhumanity to man somehow diminishes its importance. It's, you know, that it becomes just another genocide, another horrific, example, as I said, of man's inhumanity to man, rather than the worst, the worst experience, the worst perpetration against the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple points there, George. I think I would sort of sidestep the question about the distinctness of Shoah. I think that is for historians and other disciplines to argue. Yeah. I think specific interest I've had, and as I know you've had, is the question of the medical perpetrator and the fact that the National Socialist regime traded in medical metaphors to legitimate its aims, and so and as I said, the confluence of racism and eugenics, or racism and ableism, and I'd argue increasingly, as we've found out in COVID, ageism. I think this is an interesting point, that when we talk about Krankenmorde, a substantial number of victims were elderly patients who were murdered with dementia, who were murdered. The youngest victim of Brandenburg was, I think, 3, and the oldest was 90. So there is that element as well. So it's I think what comes back to, just so the medical perspective, is this observation that Leo Alexander, the sort of man who advised the Nuremberg prosecutors in the doctor's trial, he wrote this reflective piece in 1948 in the New England Journal of Medicine, where he basically said that the first step was the notion that there was a relative valuation of life, that some lives were more worthy or less worthy than others. And that is probably the thing, I think, that the take home here is that whether it is on the basis of race or gender or able-bodiedness or the like, there is this kind of idea that this foundational idea that all of these evils, these crimes, begin with this idea that you are less worthy than I. And that, I think, probably should be the reframe that we have whenever we look at a particular current situation, whether it's our First Nations, whether it's people with disabilities, the elderly, women in Canberra. It doesn't matter. It's this question of the relative valuation of life. That's how I try and keep coming back to it. Yeah,
well, I mean, the phrase "life unworthy for life" I first heard when we went on the course at Yad Vashem on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust way back in 1987, 88. So yeah, that's always been my understanding of it. And yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, clearly this discussion could have carried on for much longer, but all good things have to end. And on behalf of you all, I would like to thank Professor Robertson for his enthralling presentation, and to invite you all to make a note of our next event, which will take place on Thursday, the 3rd of March at 7:30 p.m., titled "The Abraham Accords, Holocaust Memorialization, and the Fight Against Anti-Semitism," to be presented by the current inaugural Israeli ambassador to Bahrain, the Honorable Eitan Naer, who was a co-founder of a young kibbutz together with myself and my wife. And he himself is a son of a Holocaust survivor. So very, very interesting perspectives, I believe, and I invite you to join us there. Thank you, Michael. That was riveting. I appreciate everyone hanging around for a bit longer. Look forward to seeing you again soon and have a great evening. Thank you very much.